Okay. So, hello everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the fifth lecture in a series, The Elusive Shape of the Platonic Tradition. And today, our guest is Dr. Gareth Polmeer, uh, who is based at the Royal College of Art in London. And he's an artist and senior tutor at the college, and he has interests in aesthetics and metaphysics, in addition to his artistic interests. And in particular, Dr. Polmeer is interested in the issues of technology and meaning in the context of the history and philosophy of art. He has published articles, essays, and book chapters on these subjects, among others, an essay entitled Lasting Light, Plotinus, Likeness, and Images in a volume, Platonism and Its Heritage, edited by John Finnemore and others, or an article or Poetry, Language, and Meaning, Barfield's Early Writing and the Influence of Coleridge, published in Coleridge Bulletin in 2022. So Dr. Polmeer is interested, among other things, in the Platonic tradition, in Owen Barfield and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He's also a fellow of Margaret Beaufort Institute of Theology at the University of Cambridge, and he's an active member of the Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism, and that's how we met, and we collaborate together. Um, so the floor is yours, Gareth.
Well, thank you very much. Firstly, I'd like to thank Professor Straczynski for the invitation, and it's a great honor to participate in this series of talks and ways to, I think, reimagine, rethink, and reevaluate questions about the Platonic tradition in all its forms, really. Um, as you can see from the title of my talk, I want to talk about some themes in Platonism and Christian Neoplatonism that, to my mind, are very pertinent to the current moment and to some of the questions that confront us around the nature of technology, meaning, and images, really. And to my mind, this tradition and the many thinkers under whose name it has uh, been imagined have approached these questions in different ways, which I think give us certain resources to think about the moment and how we confront technology today. So I'd like to begin with this quotation from Dante, the Paradiso, and it's a quotation, I think, that summarizes many of the ideas I'd like to discuss today on the influence of Plato and the broad ideas associated with his name. O light eternal, that alone abidest in thyself, alone knowest thyself, and known to thyself and knowing, lovest and smilest on thyself. That circling which thus begotten appeared in thee as reflected light, when my eyes dwelt on it for a time, seemed to me within it and in its own colour painted with our likeness, for which my sight was wholly given to it. And so there are several themes I'd like to address from this passage in my talk this evening. They include beauty, creativity, the climb or the ascent to a higher reality, circling, and the likeness to the divine. And in the wider context of this passage, these are themes I think that are at once mysterious, yet also grounded in reality, elusive, yet conveyed and recognized through the image of beauty. And I'll speak as someone with creative and poetic interests, and I'll also relate these passages and the other ideas associated with it to some images of my own. For it's as a world of images or a world of icons, one could say, that the Platonic philosophy appears and moves. And this has been for me its principal appeal. Images as intuited realities, shapeless and non-discursive symbols of a higher reality, but symbols which are also a resemblance or a likeness or a kind of taking shape of another reality that reveals truths about ourselves and the reality of our thinking. And so I'd like to say something about the Platonic tradition and how I've come to it principally through the creative imagination, and to some extent only secondarily through philosophy and theology. And so in this way, I speak more as an artist than I do as a philosopher, although in intention and meaning, I see these titles to share distinct characteristics. In a sense, the artist or the poet shapes elusive or shapeless things into forms or words that then point beyond themselves. The whole practice and being of the artwork is elusive. However, it's an elusiveness that's brought to bear on materials, shapes, and sounds, and it becomes something sacredly present and symbolically real, and which participates in the mysteries it represents. I'm not a traditional artist as such, insofar as I work with modern media such as digital art. And although, on the one hand, today we have a sense that digital things have a kind of spectral or immaterial existence, I think that Platonic reflections on the nature of what images are suggest something about how we can find meaning in the digital age, and also how technology can reveal to us ideas which have been historically revealed in older art forms such as painting or sculpture. In his 1850 essay, Plato or the Philosopher, Emerson writes, "The writings of Plato have preoccupied every school of learning, every lover of thought, every church, every poet, making it impossible to think on certain levels except through him. He stands between the truth and every man's mind, and has almost impressed language and the primary forms of thought with his name and seal." And so, in light of Emerson's remarks, I'd like to consider the title of the series, which is The Elusive Shape of the Platonic Tradition. And of course, if something's elusive, it's difficult to find, difficult to grasp, perhaps something that's difficult to achieve or to understand or to recognize. And so, why would we describe the Platonic tradition in this way? According to Emerson, we have a tradition that is everywhere apparent, ubiquitous, and is impressed upon us deeply. So, what about the Platonic tradition is elusive? And if it is elusive, is this in contradiction to its apparent ubiquity? I'd like to venture several reasons for describing it as elusive, and these are the persistence of the tradition, the forms of the dialogues, and what I would call a kind of metaphysical or philosophical elusiveness. So, firstly, the tradition's persistence. Over 2,000 years, the thought of Plato has taken many forms, impressed itself upon many other thinkers, Neoplatonic philosophers such as Plotinus, church fathers of the Philokalia, St. Augustine, Ficino, Dante, Blake, and many others. And yet, despite this, Platonism seems to have no central doctrine as such, but holds together a set of ideas that have an overall coherence that are reflected differently, perhaps, across the ages. And moreover, in the fundamental ideas of the Platonic tradition in Western philosophy, we find parallels with other religious and mystical traditions, a kind of perennial philosophy, as it were. The second reason for the tradition's elusiveness, which is connected to the first, is the interpretation of meaning in the dialogues, and this is connected to their poetic form. John Dillon, for example, writes that the Platonic dialogue is a literary form designed to advance philosophical positions aporetically and dialectically, not dogmatically. If we derive doctrines from them, it is, so to speak, at our own risk. And of course, we have the words attributed to Plato in the seventh letter, for it does not at all admit of verbal expression like other studies, but as a result of continued application to the subject itself and communion therewith, it is brought to birth in the soul on a sudden, as light that is kindled by a leaping spark, and thereafter it nourishes itself. And thirdly, there's what I've called the metaphysical elusiveness of the tradition. For the goal of contemplation in the tradition, in its forms, is the good or the one. But as in the Republic, the good is the sun, and we can't look directly at the sun, nor according to Plotinus can we name the one. And this kind of metaphysical elusiveness is something one finds expressed in theological terms in mystical and apophatic Christian writings, such as those of Dionysius the Areopagite or St. Gregory Palamas. The unknowable light, as St. Paul says, that no man has seen or ever can see. Or as we hear in Ecclesiastes, he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's mind, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. And here, the idea taken up in the Christian Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition is articulated through the relation of God's immanence and indwelling nature in what he reveals, and his transcendent nature, or what is beyond all knowing and seeing. And so, taken together, I believe that these different senses of the elusive, the changing tradition, the tradition's relation to the history of thought, and its metaphysical characteristics are not altogether separate matters. They point to a central feature, in fact, of the Platonic tradition, which is that philosophy or the love of wisdom is a way that involves an element of mystery, a contemplative way that ultimately resides within the divine nature of every person, insofar as they are an intelligible universe relating to the above and the below, as Plotinus says. And so one could argue, therefore, that the elusiveness of the elusiveness of the tradition is in fact a feature of its continuity. Now, another important aspect of the tradition can be traced to the Delphic injunction to know thyself, an injunction, it could be said, that seems to burden us with a task that does seem exceedingly elusive. However, the nature of the tradition to which I have already alluded myself, that of it as a way, already suggests how this self-understanding comes about. As Hegel writes in The Philosophy of Mind, the significance of that absolute commandment, know thyself, whether we look at it itself or under the historical circumstances of its first utterance, is not to promote mere self-knowledge in respect of the particular capacities, character, propensities, and foibles of the single self. The knowledge it commands means that of man's genuine reality, of what is essentially and ultimately true and real, of mind as the true and essential being. Now, I don't want to necessarily suggest here that we begin to equate Hegel's idea with Platonism as such, and to get into those kind of debates, but rather just to suggest that the implications of Hegel's statement are clear. True self-understanding is the knowledge of one's relationship to God, to the eternal, the transcendent, the universal, or the one. And to return to Platonic terms, the higher purpose of knowledge and true wisdom, whether it's gained through contemplative forms in philosophy or the arts, is what Plotinus called a turning away from things below, leading the soul to the things above. And so it seems to follow from Plotinus here, for many at least, that Platonism is elusive because it seems to be an abandonment of this world, a mysterious longing and flight from reality into some philosophical dream. On the contrary, I think that what we find is that a proper attention to higher things in this tradition deepens our understanding of the world around us, and that we are, as Plotinus says, amphibious, living part of our life here and the other in the higher world. And perhaps one other important idea to mention in relation to the visible world around us is that of beauty. For if there is something that the Platonic tradition can be said to encompass, it is a sense of the importance of the beautiful. Emerson writes The question of beauty takes us out of surfaces to thinking of the foundations of things, which is to say that the question of beauty does not take us from this world, it takes us to the very depths of the meaning of this world. Today, with the ascendancy of a digital culture that's at once spectacularly exciting yet uncertain and anxious, the search for beauty continues. And it changes its shape in some respects to the present age. Beauty comforts, beauty promises, it brings hope and redemption. Beauty is for itself when so many other things are instrumentalized in the world. And beauty is transcendent. And beauty, whatever its form, has remained a goal, both of inner self-development and contemplation, and of aspiration to higher understanding. It is there before us, and yet ever elusive. The region above the heavens has never been adequately described by any earthly poet, nor will it be, said Plato, but one must make an attempt. The remainder of my talk will now focus on how this elusiveness relates to the arts. And moreover, it will be about how the arts provide an important way of revealing the tradition's elusive features. For the arts, it would be argued, are a key form of revelation for this tradition. And as I've mentioned at the beginning, the aesthetic element, the poetic elements, the imaginative elements of the Platonic tradition have been what I have found particularly compelling. Kathleen Raine writes that the Platonic tradition may be likened to an underground river that from time to time sends up a spring. Wherever its waters flow, the soul is reborn, and with it the conception of intellectual form, the beautiful and true art. I'll frame my considerations through reflections on the mystical and apophatic element of the Christian Neoplatonic tradition, considered as a kind of striving or ascent towards the one, the good or the divine. Firstly, I'll discuss Philip Sherard's view on Platonism and art, a view that is that sees art and human creativity as participating in and truly reflecting the nature of the transcendent iconographically. Secondly, I will discuss the metaphysics of light. Thirdly, images of wings and ascent. And fourthly, images of the sphere and circle. In the discussion of light, wings and circles, I'll reference some of my own artworks and creative interests and offer some reflections on the Platonic tradition pertinent to today's world, some of my own encounters with the tradition, and the ways in which the resources of the tradition can be thought anew with some of the challenges of the present day, such as the nature of the digital world. And the consideration that there is a kind of Platonic art could be met with the objection that Plato would banish poets from the city. But of course, in the same place, Plato commends those who write hymns to the gods, suggesting a particular understanding of the purpose and aims of art. Sherard writes that Platonic art is iconographical, and in fact that this mode of art is normal to all cultures with a living religious tradition. That is, the making of an image as a copy of a model or archetype, a copy in which there is a kinship or a presence of the one within the other. He says there is a real sharing or participation of the image in the archetypal reality that is shown forth. The image is this archetypal reality in another form. Sherard draws attention to various passages in the dialogue, such as the Laws, where we hear of the extent to which art corresponds correctly to its model, as an image to an original. Cratylus, where we hear that one should learn from the original as to whether the likeness is a good copy. And the Timaeus, where Plato describes the difference between knowledge and opinion, in doing so remarking upon the practice of the craftsman. What is that which is existent always and has no becoming? And what is that which is becoming always and never is existent? Now, the one of these is apprehensible by thought with the aid of reasoning, since it is ever uniformly existent, whereas the other is an object of opinion with the aid of unreasoning sensation, since it becomes and perishes and is never really existent. Again, everything which becomes must of necessity become owing to some cause, for without a cause it is impossible for anything to attain becoming. But when the artificer of an object, in forming its shape and quality, keeps his gaze fixed on that which is uniform, using a model of this kind, that object executed in this way must of necessity be beautiful. But whenever he gazes at that which has come into existence and uses a creative model, the object thus executed is not beautiful. Sherard has drawn attention to this passage and to differences in the Republic, for example, on how Plato criticizes or commends the artist. And a number of other Platonic scholars have also argued, powerfully, I think, for a more poetic or dramatic reading of the dialogues, suggesting that this points both to the relationship and quarrel, as it were, between philosophy and poetry, but also to an ambiguity in the dialogues themselves with regard to their artistic or poetic form. Again, Kathleen Raine claims Plato is the philosopher of the arts. The Platonic philosophy is the necessary basis of all imaginative art. The Platonic tradition has lived on as the learning of the poets like a secret language. Together with the philosophy are associated those gods, myths, symbolic figures and stories which not only Plato himself, but Plotinus and all the later Platonic philosophers employ. The Platonic artist and poet philosophize. The Platonic philosopher mythologizes. Eva Brann asks why a painter or poet might not also vault to a direct, non-dialectical contemplation of the forms. She describes Socrates and Plato as philosophical poets who know how to engage in image making, in capturing and bringing down into appearance the highest beings in the realm of images. Stanley Rosen has argued for a dramatic and poetic reading of the dialogues. He says, there seems to be no reason why poets cannot also be philosophers. That is, why they cannot themselves perceive the genuine forms that are the originals of the particulars they imitate. And it's generally suggested that Plotinus develops Plato's account of imitation into a different conception of the arts, a more positive conception perhaps. Plotinus speaks of an inner vision which guides the artist's creation. In Ennead 5:8, he says, if someone lacks respect for the crafts on the grounds that they make imitations of nature, it should be said first that natural things imitate other things. Next, one should know that it is not simply that which is seen that they imitate, but they go back to the express principles from which nature comes. Next as well, one should know that the crafts produce many things by themselves, and as they possess beauty, they supply whatever is missing, as in the case of Phidias too, who did not produce his statue of Zeus according to anything sensible, but grasping what he would be if Zeus wanted to appear before our eyes. And so Plotinus suggests that the artist in a way moves between sensible and intelligible realities, looking to higher principles from whence the images derive. Pierre Hadot, in his commentary on Plotinus, says that art must not copy reality, for in that case it would only be an inferior copy of that copy which is the object perceived by our senses. The true function of art is heuristic. Through the work of art we discover or invent the eternal model, the idea of which sensible reality is a mere image. The work of art is an attempt to imitate this idea. The artist's work can be a symbol of the quest for our true self. Thus, art is not only concerned with externalization, but internalization, a deepening of inner understanding. And I've always found it both beautiful and fitting in this respect that Plotinus chooses the image of the sculptor to describe the way in which we can embark on this quest for our true self. In Ennead 1:6, how then can you see the kind of beauty that a good soul has? go back into yourself and look. If you do not yet see yourself as beautiful, then be like a sculptor who, making a statue that is supposed to be beautiful, removes a part here and polishes a part there. Do not stop working on your statue until the divine splendor of virtue shines in you. Indeed, Adot has said this of all Plotinus's work, writing that his treatises are spiritual exercises in which the soul sculpts herself. So Plotinus's wonderful description here of the human person as a kind of contemplative sculptor relates, I believe, to something that is then taken up strongly within the Christian Platonic tradition of the creative imagination. Because the human person is an image, likeness, or reflection of God in which they participate, their very nature to create, in words, in acts, or in artworks, is itself another reflection or likeness of God. Sherard says, for example, that by virtue of the fact that man is created in the image of God, he is also a creator, a maker, an artist. Indeed, this is his distinguishing role, that which is capable of making him holy. The iconographic nature of the human being is related to their capacity for theosis, to be divinized or made holy. And we find such ideas in St. Augustine. He writes, "It is thou who didst make a body for the artisan, a mind which controls his members, a matter from which he makes anything, a talent whereby to grasp his art and see within what he may make externally, a bodily sense as a medium through which he may project his artifact from mind to matter and bring back a report of what has been made to the mind, so that he may consult the truth presiding within himself as to whether it has been well made." Here we have echoes of the passage from Plotinus of Phidias's inner vision. And as with the suggestion of Timaeus that the artist produces beautiful things by looking inside, which is to say with Plotinus that one looks within oneself to see something higher, God's creation of the creative capacities of the person in Augustine's account gives a person the sensible and intellectual abilities to reflect upon ultimate truths creatively and imaginatively. As this was put by Gregory Palamas, the human soul is something great and wondrous, superior to the entire world. It overlooks the universe and has all things in its care. It is capable of knowing and receiving God, and more than anything else has the capacity of manifesting the sublime magnificence of the master craftsman. Having discussed these ideas of Platonic art, Plotinus's contemplative and sculptural imagery, and the divine creative capacities of the artist, I'd now like to turn to the three themes of my work: light, wings, and circles, and then to reflect upon some aesthetic and contemplative aspects of the Platonic tradition, to consider the use of symbols and images in a way which reflects different Platonic principles. The first of these is light, and from the illuminating sun outside the cave to the participatory symbolism of Plotinus's Enneads, the sun and its glorifying light has symbolically encapsulated some of the most beautiful imagery of the Platonic tradition. In the Symposium, we hear of Socrates that from daybreak he'd been standing in meditation on the spot, contemplating something. And when he was making no progress at it, he didn't give up, but stood there searching. And he did stand there until it was dawn and the sun rose. Then he went off after praying to the sun. And I'd like to say something as an artist here about the physical and metaphysical qualities of light. And I'd like to comment about this on two levels. The first of these is concerned with light in the broadly philosophical sense, as in Socrates' petitions to the sun or his description of the good. The second concerns the representation of or shaping of light in a material way. such that it transforms into or imitates something higher. And I'd say that these two descriptions, this separation, if you like, is for convenience, insofar as it helps to explain light in the Platonic tradition. But of course, they can be seen to relate. For example, in this beautifully poetic passage, again from St. Gregory Palamas, man being himself light sees the light with the light. If he regards himself, he sees the light, and if he regards the object of his vision, he finds the light there again. And the means that he employs for seeing is the light, and it is in this that union consists, for all this is but one. So here the material and immaterial qualities of light, the inner and outer qualities of light in its perception, and the description of light in poetic terms all serve to represent a sense of divine transformation. There are many passages in Plotinus where this is expressed, perhaps famously in Ennead 1:6 of the one who sees having a kinship with that which is seen. For no eye has ever seen the sun without becoming sunlike, nor could a soul ever see beauty without becoming beautiful. For Plotinus, says Pierre Hadot, when vision becomes spiritual, there is no longer any distinction between inner and outer light. Vision is light, and light is vision. There is a kind of self-vision of light, in which light is, as it were, transparent to itself. And what can we say of the artist's work with light? We could say, if they were a kind of Platonists, that they may attune their contemplation of light in two ways. Firstly, to its metaphysical qualities, such as the firm transcendent beam which draws sacred mind upwards, as Dionysius the Areopagite says. The Platonist artist would understand that an invisible light illuminates the soul and that such a light has many names. They might understand that beyond the material rays that warm and glitter, there lies an unknowable light that is its source. And of the physical, sensible light, the second element to which the artist focuses their contemplative practice, the artist might understand its symbolic function, which is that it can be representative of the metaphysical light. And through this simultaneous contemplation of these two forms of light, the artist can approach their work in a way that bridges and interconnects the light, attempting to make work which shapes sensible light in such a way that it is informed by the metaphysical light and also represents it. An example of this might be the decoration of stained glass. The surface of the glass might depict something mysterious, as it were, something beyond material representation. The glass acts as a medium for the light, with the rays passing through it and illuminating the space around it, and in doing so, suspends the light in a space of contemplative understanding between the material and the immaterial. The same might be said of the surface of a painting, and even, I think, of the shaping of pixels on screens, where if light is shaped with a kind of Platonic intent to not merely be light, but a symbol of a higher light. And it's in this latter sense I've found particularly interesting approaches in my own practice. With light as this overarching interest, two further Platonic symbols and forms also form part of my creative interests, both of which in their own ways are also connected to light. The first of these is wings. And some of my recent work, including the work you can see at the moment, are inspired by flight, by winged figures, figures in a kind of dance or ascent. In various ways, I've sought to explore patterns and movement of flight, of feathers, abstract representations of angelic figures in flight. And of course, this has been drawn from some of my interests and inspiration in the Platonic tradition. In the Phaedrus, of course, Plato likens the soul to the natural union of a team of winged horses and their charioteer. So long as its wings are in perfect condition, it flies high. But a soul that sheds its wings wanders until it lights on something solid, where it settles and takes on an earthly body. And the flight upwards that's described in the Phaedrus myth depicts a struggle, if you like, between the higher and lower aspects of the self, upwards reaching to the heavens, downwards to the body. It's beauty, wisdom, and goodness that nourish the soul's wings, and the wings are elements of the body that are closest to the divine. The heavens are a place without colour, without shape, without solidity, a being that really is what is, the subject of all true knowledge, visible only to intelligence, the soul's steersman. And one can look to many, many writers uh, who have been influenced by the Platonic writings to see other references of this kind. In the Consolation of Philosophy, Boethius writes, "For I have wings equipped to fly up to the high vaults of the sky." Dante writes of a need to fly with the swift wings and plumage of great desire, and of how his feathers grow for flight. The spiritual bird, writes John Scottaserio Jenner, is fast flying, God seeing, ascends beyond all visible and invisible creation. And William Blake speaks of imagination and the fiery chariot of contemplative thought. And wings, of course, are also angelic. The Meditations on the Tarot paints a striking image in the discussion of angels, wings, and flight. The bird flies by beating its wings against the air, by resting on the air. The angel flies by immobilizing its wings after having touched God. One wing holds him in contact with divine understanding, and the other with divine memory, imagination. The two wings are therefore related to the contemplative and creative aspects of God, which in their turn correspond to the divine image and likeness in man. As in the Phaedrus, with the two horses representing the inner conflict and relationship of the higher and lower aspects of the human being, here the pair of wings also serves to illustrate a symbolic reality associated with an ascent of the soul. As Sherard describes human creativity in the terms of the likeness of God, as Augustine speaks of human artworks deriving from God's creation of the human capacity to create, the description of wings here is contemplative and creative, corresponding to a divine likeness. The shape and movement of the flight and ascent of the soul leads me to another symbolic form in the Platonic tradition, the sphere and the circle. And as you've seen, this form and movements pertaining to circularity are important elements of the images I've shown. Faith, hope, and love are pictured, one as a ray, one as light, and one as a disc, by John Climacus in The Ladder of Divine Ascent. And Dante's vision in the Paradiso is moved by a desire and will like a wheel that spins with even motion, revolved by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. In Ennead 2:2, Plotinus describes circular movements. The lower soul is moved by the higher, which encompasses it in a circle and bears upon all of it that has risen to the spheres. So the lower soul, as the higher encircles it, inclines and tends towards it, and its tendency carries round the body with which it is interwoven. For if any particular part of a sphere is moved even in the slightest degree, then if it only is moved, it stirs that in which it is, and the sphere is set in motion. In our bodies too, when our soul is moved in a different way from the body, by joy for instance, and by something which appears good to it, then there is a spatial movement of the body as well. And in heaven, where the soul is in good and more visibly perceptive, it moves to the good and sets its body moving in space in the manner natural to it there. The perceptive power in its turn receives the good from that which is above, and in delight pursues its own, and is carried elsewhere, everywhere, to the good which is everywhere. This is how intellect is moved. It is both at rest and in motion, for it moves around him. So then the universe too both moves in its circle and is at rest. And we see here an image I find very appealing, the sense of the bodily and the intellectual moving in these circles, which I think connects to a sense of how the intelligible and the sensible relate to the creative process. The life of a man is a self-evolving circle, said Emerson, which from a ring imperceptibly small rushes on all sides outwards to new and larger circles, and that without end. In conclusion, I'd like to offer some brief reflections on how Platonic art forms relate to digital and the digital and technological world of today, reflecting on some of the things I've spoken about and my own creative interests. I think in some ways, technological culture has placed a certain kind of emphasis on separating the body, the soul, intellect. And perhaps this is so because there's been some tendencies to reduce thinking to bits and data, to meaningless arrangements of signals, and therefore to easily allied human nature with machines. But the discursive or calculative nature of thinking is only one component of the story of our nature, of course. And in the Platonic tradition, this is expanded and enriched not only through our capacity for intellection, for vision, for contemplation of what exceeds discursive knowledge, but also, as we saw in Plotinus's passages just there, of the relation between the body, the soul, intellect, and the movement and ascent of circularity. Philosophy, theology, and art together, particularly as it's been brought together by the Platonic tradition, I think, can help us to understand our relationship to technology. For technological thought doesn't provide the basis for its own validity. Platonic thought shows us the importance of imagination in a vision of our bodily and higher natures. And the instrumentalization of humanity, which we see within some aspects of digital culture, does in fact reduce us to data, to transactions. But the Platonic tradition shows us how our nature is greater than the logic of machines. As St. Augustine tells us, the more the soul extends itself towards that which is eternal, the more it is reformed according to the image of God. And our art, too, I'd like to suggest, can also exceed utility and instrumentalization and take the shape of a lightness which is beyond all images and shape. I'd emphasize here that I don't reactionarily oppose technology. And in fact, of course, part of what I've been saying has been to show that working creatively with computers or other kinds of new media can reflect Platonic principles. Furthermore, in the light of thinkers such as the Catholic philosopher of media Marshall McLuhan, who argued for a serious re-examination of faith, modernity, and technology, I believe that technology can be informed by a deepened understanding of faith and the Platonic tradition. And this, in turn, can inform the ways in which the spiritual imagination confronts the challenges of our times. As painting or sculpture shapes elusive things into forms that suggest something more, so too pixels, screens, and the other aspects of technological art might show us something meaningful. It could be that the role of the contemplative Platonic artist is to counter the reductive circumstances I have described, creating images that derive from another reality, the higher reality of which the world is an image. The artist's creative vision is based upon a contemplative understanding of the relationship of the transcendent to the worldly, that is to say, a vision of both the sensible and the intelligible. And this kind of vision is not the same as machine or computational vision. And this doesn't mean that artists' creative vision might not be augmented by new technologies, or that those technologies might open new realms of the imagination. But I think it does suggest something particular about the intuitive capacity of human creativity. In the allegory of the cave, looking at shadows on the wall and attempting to stare directly at the sun put us both in a kind of error. And the Platonic tradition shows a vast number of ways that writers, artists, and poets of many kinds have drawn upon an ever present source of wisdom that can be called Platonic, where the artist moves between immanence and transcendence, between the light of the sun, the shadows of the cave. And so, in our new age of digital images, the spectres of AI generated media, it seems that we can revive a skill of discerning true from false images by training our attention on higher forms, so that, as Plotinus says, as one proceeds in their ascent, one sees by oneself alone that which is itself alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that rich presentation, lecture. Uh, and I open the discussion. Anyone
Thank you.
has a question or a remark or a comment? I was thinking about the last section when you refer to technology, uh, because yeah, I remembered that in 1990s I read there were popular in Poland there were popular these little essays by Umberto Eco, and the he was very popular in Poland in 1990s for some reason. Now he's rarely mentioned. But one of these short essays by Eco is he refers to Plato's Phaedrus and the famous critique of writing in a kind of a science fiction way where someone discovers the archaeological remnants of our culture uh, and in any case the point that Eco makes is that our fear of computers well there was not internet back then but our fear of computers uh, is similar to what we find in Phaedrus 2000 and 300 years earlier. So that the fear that because of the invention of writing, people will stop remembering, and you know Socrates is saying that you know we will lose our memory, and you know writing is frozen and fixed, and we cannot enter a dialogue into a dialogue with the written text, and so so basically the point he makes in the Phaedrus is that you cannot use writing as a medium of philosophical dialogue, pursuit of truth, and this is of course famously puzzling uh, point made by Plato, who was one of the geniuses of literary art. Uh, so I think there is in this essay by Eco there is a grain of truth that we tend to react with this kind of suspicion and either excessive fascination with technology, and writing is a technology, of course. Technology is not only computers and internet. I mean, writing is technology, parchment is technology, print is technology. All so we tend to be either fascinated by that, like with AI nowadays, or we become suspicious and anxious and preoccupied and all of that. I think it's interesting how this repeats itself. And I think that the Platonic tradition is deeply sort of connected to this problem of the artificial, the problem of technology, since the times of Plato through the Middle Ages and the romantic reaction to the machine, for instance, and the sort of modern reaction to technology. So I think it's really hard because we are sort of forced to either oppose technology and to say, no, this kills our spirit, this is dangerous. We have to reject that and come back to nature. Or we tend to idealize technology, right? And we tend to think, all our problems will be solved, we will become superhuman. And so I think it's interesting. Maybe you could say a bit more about how in your artistic work, I mean, the use of computers and technology, is it sometimes like a hindrance or a problem that you have to overcome, or is it helpful in, well, could you elaborate more on that,
Yeah,
Gareth?
it's interesting. Uh, I think you're right to point out the essentially double-edged nature of how we relate to technology and the sort of moral panics that emerge over emergent and new technologies. Um, and one finds this, of course, uh, in different ways in relationship to the concern you flagged there about the nature of writing and fixing ideas into a permanent form. It's one thing that speaks interestingly to the if you like, slightly elusive nature of the dialogue form in a sense, and the nature of interpretation of those dialogues as to whether there is a uh, Platonic philosophy, as it were. Is there a philosopher Plato advancing a series of positions and so on, or is this more ambiguous and uncertain and so on? And of course, the very nature of the artistic form of those dialogues, which in many respects is something lost in a lot of very technical forms of contemporary philosophy, for instance. Um, I'm also quite fascinated by the, uh, if you like, what you might call the kind of isomorphic connection between emergent technological forms and how they come to be symbolically um, dominant or symbolically representative of an age. So I think you can find with um, writers like Helmholtz in the late 19th century, the emergence of the telegraph. We find language starting to refer to transmissions in the brain as if there are signals passing along wires, or we find with the emergence of mass communications, Benjamin's idea of the loss of the auratic nature of objects in time and space, or we find with the emergence of the internet and technology that we start to talk about, I can't thoughts like data, or not being able to process the information and so forth. So I think this is something quite fascinating that shows something about how meaning exceeds discursivity in that respect, because it exceeds the nature of the descriptions we use to try and tackle those problems. Um, and it's something that Owen Barfield, for example, as a platonically influenced thinker, I believe, is very persuasive and interesting on as a subject. How, in a sense, it's the essential nature of poetic language and creativity generally to try to escape that sort of prison of language in some ways, which imposes sometimes dominant symbolic forms upon how we understand the world. Um, as to how that relates to the way that I work with those technologies, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, clearly, um, we're at a certain stage with a number of the generative AI tools that are out there. Whether that's ChatGPT or Mid Journey in terms of image generation, other things like this, text prompt based tools where we can give instructions to things and they can generate vast amounts of content, uh, soon to be embedded within smartphone devices to great degrees. used by many academics, I'm sure, in different ways for writing things or researching as well. So we're certainly at a sort of interesting phase. And what you referred to there in terms of Socrates and the idea that I suppose if we um, a kind of amnesis, if we uh, commit ourselves to a kind of certain technology, in that case writing, then perhaps we lose something, or we lose an ability to philosophize or to think. Well, certainly you could say that's potentially one of the threats of these newer systems, that they will, uh, take away, as it were, some aspect of our own volition to do those things because it will do it for us. Um, that's the negative view, I suppose. On the other hand, I suppose there are things that it enables one to do, and uh, certainly one can dialogue with those things in certain ways, perhaps to bring out or reveal other aspects of their nature, and for creative purposes, as people have done with any technology in a way, whether that's television or film or radio. Um, so yeah, as I said in the talk, I'm not, I'm neither a sort of, technological pessimist nor a sort of, technological utopian optimist. I sort of think we have to steer a sort of via media, as it were. But
What I find interesting in what you said about Socrates and the Phaedrus and Plato in general is that you also mentioned Stanley Rosen and some remarks by John Dillon, and also well, that David Schindler is in that tradition of seeing Platonic dialogues as these images of philosophizing, or these enactments of philosophy. So it seems like Plato is, well, even if he's saying that writing is dangerous potentially, then he takes this technological medium and does things with it which seem to overcome the danger, right? So he is well, as you said very rightly, I think that the problem with writing is that it's fixity. So, I make like bullet point, Platonic philosophy in bullet points, right? And then your mind goes brain dead. But Plato doesn't do it, right? He invites you to a dialogue, to a story. So he tries to make the writing alive instead of fixed, and he does this because he's a genius. So in a way, it's the technology is transformed from within, and then it's at service of reality. Although Plato still says, but there is a real danger that it will drag you down back into the cave instead of letting more light to the cave. So I find it
yeah,
interesting, this sort of circularity of our relationship with technology. For a period of time, I thought, that this smartphones and things like, Facebook or Instagram, whatever, that this is something, it drags us down because, people are, when they are waiting in lines or they have a doctor's appointment, they are just, scrolling something, and they are giving themselves to distraction and this mindlessness, right? We all are tempted to do it. But then sometimes I think, well, okay, I can put down the smartphone, but then my mind starts to do the same. And all spiritual teachers, from the Desert Fathers to Zen masters, they for centuries they were saying that our mind is doing this scrolling without any need for a smartphone to be there. So now we idealize not looking at a smartphone as if it suddenly turns us into contemplatives. It doesn't. I mean, even if I don't have a smartphone, I can just repeat stupid thoughts and images and recycle memories. And there's nothing essentially more, nothing essentially better in that than in using a smartphone. But I think it's, the problem. raised by Pascal, who was speaking about, the role of distraction. And he said famously that all the unhappiness of humankind stems from the fact that we are unable to sit at rest in a room. And there is this recent psychological experiment, that people were told to do nothing for 20 minutes, I think, but the only thing they could do is to apply an electric shock, painful but not damaging electric shock to themselves. And I guess 70% of people prefer to administer this electric shock instead of just sit and do nothing. So yeah, but it's the same perennial problem of our, that we are caught in this play of our mind. And I think the internet or the screens is just an externalization of that. And then we say, okay, so take away the screens, which may be a good idea, of course, but it doesn't solve the problem entirely. So this would be this kind of Platonic defense of technology, that as an image, like in Plotinus, Narcissus is looking into the image, and he falls into the water and dies. But we cannot fall into the water. We can realize that we are looking at an image, and we can have a different relationship to the image.
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, McLuhan uses that very image. There's a chapter of his famous book, Understanding Media, called Narcissus as Narcosis. And, it's in reference to this idea that technology becomes a kind of an extension that then detaches, as it were. I mean, what's interesting as well about what you said there is that, um, yes, I think it's easy for us to attribute a sort of certain agency to these things, these devices, that, oh, it's doing this to me, as it were. And as you said, one of Plotinus's first lessons is, look inside, stop looking, close your eyes and change your way of seeing, look inside, shape your inner self, as it were. Um, but the thing is, I suppose, is that um, one thing I find quite fascinating is that in really, I suppose, more advanced technological societies, as it were, the which are in a sense becoming increasingly secular, alongside that technological development, um, still this longing, this need, this desire for transcendence exists, and in a way that is being channeled through certain kinds of technological ambitions. So, uh, I mean, I suppose one obvious example would be something like, well, you can have a live forever in the cloud or something. I don't know, or upload your mind, or whatever that would mean. I mean, I think philosophically there's all kinds of problems, but the point being that this sense of the eros, the things I've been talking about in some ways, of some feeling for wanting to ascend to some higher idea. This in a sort of uh, different form is part of the technological ambition in some way. Um, so in place of uh, the organized religion of old, or of traditional spiritual ideas, there's a kind of technological spiritualism or something like this. A belief that this would in fact overcome the superstitions of the past and allow us to, reach some new um, heaven, but with technology. So this also seems to be one of its dangers or ideas, I suppose, as well, um, that aren't altogether unconnected from their distractive and addictive functions in some cases. But again, just to reiterate, I think this isn't the whole picture. And I think, as you brilliantly put there, of course, the very nature of the dialogues is, in a sense, to somehow use the technology to overcome the technology, as it were.
Mm. Yeah. Anyone wants to join the discussion? Or you can, of course, relate to another aspect of it if you want. But another thought was that really it's very useful. I mean, I'm not familiar with McLuhan, unfortunately, although it really sounds interesting what he has to say. But that our relationship to technology is that of an archetype to an image. So in a sense, you can say that a computer is an image of the human mind, which, as all images, it's limited, it's weaker, just a on the one hand, it's just a flawed reflection of human thought, but on the other hand, it participates in our thought. Its entire reality, although AI people seem to think differently, but its entire reality is based on our reality. Without us, there would be no AI. I mean, this AI feeds on us as an image feeds on its archetype. Um, so, in a sense, we project we project images of ourselves, and technology is just that. But what you mentioned, I think, quoting McLuhan, is that these images sort of separate from ourselves and start to have this strange ghostly life of themselves, or at least it seems so. Uh, yeah, which is, well, exactly what the church fathers would say about the fall of the soul, or Plotinus for that matter. So the soul, being an image of God, separates itself and wants to have its own existence in opposition to God. That's the fall. So in a sense, what we think about technology and just the fear of the machine, like the Stanley Kubrick's Odyssey 2000 or Matrix. This is all about like the fall of the machines, right? The machine symbolizes this act of rebellion, separation from its maker. It's so you can see it in a very traditionally Platonic and metaphysical and religious way as well, right? And that's why I mean, your last point that it's curious how many science fiction movies have this religious dimension, like Kubrick's movie that I mentioned, or The Matrix, or it really is uses technological aspects, and all of that to speak about the same old themes.
Yes, no, I think that's right. And uh, yeah, as you say, I think these are reflections in some way, or images of our nature. Um, and yeah, depending on which side of the debate you fall, as it were, as to whether machines are intelligent, whatever that might mean, then you might think that they are, in a sense, have separated themselves to some degree. Uh, but irrespective of whether you think that, they are images which, in a way, have, in McLuhan's sense, broken away from us, but then look back at us, and so yeah, absolutely. It's precisely the reason that science fiction deals with these themes so widely.
Well, yes, and I think that, well, Professor Strużyński and also Gareth were talking about the idea of man as the Platonic idea of and Christian idea of man as an image of the creator, so a smaller, less perfect creator in himself, and the way in which our times are with the emergence of AI, especially, well, interesting, and for some exciting, for some quite terrifying, is that probably for the first time in history, our creations, so another lower level of creation or image of an image of the creator, started to, or appears to have started to, create things on their own.
Yes, but well, I think you can see that already in the literature of late 18th century and early 19th century, the like the motive of the machine, or the theme of the fear of the machine emerges. I mean,
Oh,
the Nutcracker is, I don't remember, but it's early 19th century story, uh, or or Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I mean, all these. I mean, it's now we think, well, now it's the moment we should be afraid. But this is, of course, you can say that, it's developing, and printing press was a big change. I mean, I don't think, on the one hand, I said, it's just repeating. It's the old themes are repeating themselves, but from another angle, they are not just repeating themselves because Plato was afraid of writing itself and its fixity, but the printing press really seemed to, well, change even our brains and the way we process. We no longer we hear, we listen to literature. Now we scan visually. So something really changed. We were changed by our creatures, but no one is afraid of the printing press anymore because now we are. We are. Yeah, but well, what was it? It was 18th century. People destroying machines in England. What there was this
yeah,
movement
during
of,
the Industrial Revolution.
yeah, there,
Yeah.
the mobs of people were just destroying machines because they were afraid that they will lose their jobs, and so yeah, so this is, I mean, it's a funny thing about history is that you can look at this and see these recurring patterns, although they're slightly
19th
changed
century.
In the 19th century.
19th century, the Luddites.
Luddites, yeah. Which is a term, of course, we still use today as usually as an insult
Oh.
sometimes to someone who is a reactionary about technology. Would be called, people call them a Luddite. Yeah.
Yeah. So of course I'm aware, Professor, that the idea and the fear of the machine has existed for some time in one way or another, but it really seems, but so far it has been mostly in terms of the fear of a living machine, or a machine that simulates life, was mostly in the realm of fantasy or science fiction, but as of this moment, as of a couple of years, it's finally emerging into reality.
Well, for a time, I have been fascinated by this topic of the relationship between the machine and the ghost, or the demonic. I talked about this in Cambridge in September, because I think that it's really interesting how in Tolkien and in J.K. Rowling you see the overlap of these two things. And C.S. Lewis somewhere said that we are afraid of ghosts because ghost is it's not a full human being. It's it's an imitation of human beings. It's like a part of us which seems to, yeah. And I think it's very perceptive because a ghost, it looks like a human being sort of, but it's not. Maybe it can speak, but in a weird voice. You cannot touch it, or maybe you can sort of touch it and you just feel cold. So it's a ghost in traditional imaginary. A ghost is almost like a this projected picture of a full human being, and we are scared of this because it seems so unnatural, so like it's like us, but it's not like us, and we so I think it's that there is something in common between ghosts and machines. Machines seem to be like us. They do the same things that we can do, and there are these similarities, but the similarities make us even more scared because they are unlike us, very very much unlike us. So I think it's a strange topic of sort of that we are afraid of images when the images seem to take too much independence, and if they seem to be able to somehow replace the archetypes, then we have this almost metaphysical horror. And yeah, that's
If I may, about that, this relation between the ghost and the machine is a central topic of certain science fiction, especially in Japan and also in Western countries like Ghost in the Shell. The theme is exactly that: how can I understand who is human and who is basically a replicant, something that seems to be human, maybe as also seems to have emotions, well, also is the same theme as Blade Runner, for example. Yes, so I mean, I think that, yes, this fear of the ghost that seems to be human, but it is not human, has been basically moved to the machines. Yes, that's really interesting. And I think that another author that is worthy to bring up is Baudrillard and simulacra and simulations, since maybe the thing is that we fear that the machine, the ghost, basically is like our simulacrum, but is devoid of any, not only emotion, but also reason or anything that for us means something. And I think that we fear that we ourselves as humanity are losing what makes us human. So maybe
sure.
this is another example of a projection of our fears on machines, in this case, or on ghosts. Yes. And
Yeah.
another also at the beginning, I think, or at the end of the 19th, at the beginning of the 19th, or at the end of this 18th, who also addressed this was Hoffman. So, like, I think it's the Sandman in English. Uh,
Hoffman.
the yes,
Yeah, the
yes.
nutcracker, nutcracker.
Yes, also
Yeah.
the Sandman over the ballet and the opera was
Yes.
Coppelia. Yes, so
Yeah,
that
but also, well, Pinocchio as well. Pinocchio
yes,
is also the so, and yeah, I think the common theme is deception and fear of deception. So, in the Middle Ages and early modernity, people were afraid, of demonic deception, that they we fall into some kind of lie and illusion, and we cannot tell the difference between, is it a real angel, or is it Satan pretending to be the angel of light. And I think it's, as you say, it's the same with our fear of all things fake right now. Yeah? So this fear of deep fake, for instance, it's a fear that we will not be able to tell the difference between reality and an image. And this seems a very interesting and philosophical and religious theme, right? Because Satan is the great deceiver. He's the great liar. So in a sense, yeah, it's this. I'm coming back to this relationship between an image and archetype, right? So on the one hand, an image, because it's so similar to the archetype, it can be this window through which we see the archetype, and that's the sacred dimension of the art that Gareth was talking about. So by looking at images, we can sort of look through them into God or into eternal beauty and things like that. But at the same time, these images can be deceiving. They can lead us away from God. This is the whole iconoclastic tradition of, Byzantine iconoclasm, the Protestant iconoclasm. And of course, in Muslim culture, complete ban on all images, right? And so there is this tension always in us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that it is interesting that on internet we can basically create an ideal image of us in some ways, no? Like an internet persona or avatar in certain games, for example, which is like our ideal extension, no? But this is not, of course, the same concept of idea that Plato had. But yeah, so I mean, there is this recurring term which is ideal or idea, but we have to, of course, distinguish what is an idea in this case. So again, I think that the risk is that our ideal projection in the internet is again a simulacrum in reality. Yes. So yeah, so it's really really interesting, but it's quite complicated to discuss this in
Yeah, but I think it can be
on the
linked
spot.
to what Gareth mentioned about whether the art is a copy of a copy, whether art copies sensible reality or Platonic forms. Because in a sense, if by means of technology we create our ideal self, it can be seen in a bad way. So this is just a copy of us. But uh, from the other perspective, maybe we are doing what Plotinus ascribed to Phidias. So Phidias is creating a idealized image of a god, for instance, right? So yeah, and like the same problem with literature. Aristotle says that Sophocles didn't depict in his tragedies, he didn't depict real people. He depicted people as they should be, right? And Euripides depicted them as they really are, and Sophocles depicted them as they should be. And Aristotle referred Sophocles to Euripides. So this is not all idealization is bad, because it seems that some idealization can be this the imitation of the Platonic idea from a certain perspective.
Yeah, which I think precisely goes to show that um, there are so many interesting and very relevant things about the dialogues and other aspects of the Platonic tradition, which are far from outdated, in the sense that they can speak to many of these perennial questions, really.
Hmm. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Gareth, for this lecture. And thank you for showing your art, which I think is really beautiful and captivating in a spiritual way. So it's really interesting how you use technology and computers to create something which can be open to this sacred dimension. That's really interesting and very Platonic. So,
Thank you very
and
much.
thank you, yeah, thank you for giving the context and the traditional historical context for art as a integral part of the Platonic tradition. Okay, and thank you also for participating in discussion to others. And yeah, see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much, Gareth.
Thank you.
you.
Good night. Thank you.